All right, so welcome everyone to our presentation on the new release of zoning codes. This is our second release, adding to the material released in February. Tonight we have what should be the familiar ZAP team by now, myself, Roseanne, Kevin Kelly, Johanna Brenner, and Doreen Kirkmeyer. And we are joined by our consultants on the project, Camiros, who you will meet a little later on in the presentation. We are going to present an overview of the release, followed by an opportunity for questions and discussion. We will not be pausing the presentation to discuss the material presented until the end, at which time we will have a Q&A session and an opportunity for commentary. If you like, you can put clarifying questions in the chat, and Doreen will do her best to answer them in real time. If you need to leave early, please remember that comments can be left on the website. This is an informational meeting, and we really hope that we're going to be able to answer a lot of your questions, but that all of your comments about the code should be left on the website so that we can collate them and address them. And with that, we're going to start the presentation. As I said, this is our second batch of code that we are releasing. This follows the adoption of Rochester 2034 and the comprehensive plan adopted in 2019. We anticipate completion of this entire process winter of 23 to early spring of 24. We have held throughout this process community and stakeholder meetings, and we will continue to do so until the point that it is adopted. Oops. Our first batch, which was released in January of 2022, included the draft zoning map, the use table, the use standards, and the use definition. For information on these items, you can go to the ZAP website, where everything that we give out to the public or we release to the public, you will be able to find a link for that on the ZAP website. The current release, which is our second batch, includes district standards, which includes dimensional and design regulations, so things like setbacks and yards, general development standards, accessory structures and use standards, and relevant definitions and rules of measurement. The next batch to be released in the fall of 2022 will include parking, signage, landscaping, urban renewal districts, planned development districts, nonconformities, administrative procedures, enforcement, and two of our overlay districts, the Airport Overlay District and the Environmental Protection Overlay District. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to share something about our goals.
Thanks so much, Roseanne. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and taking time out of your busy schedules. My name's Kevin, and I work in the Office of City Planning for the City of Rochester, and our team works in close partnership with Roseanne and her team in zoning and some others to develop this zoning alignment project. So she's kind of set the table there for what content, what topics are covered by this sort of second release of the batch of code and what we're going to be talking about tonight. But before we get a little bit further into the details of what is in this second release, I like to do a refresher here about what are the overall goals and objectives of this project. Many of you on the call tonight are familiar with it. We appreciate that you've been staying involved and coming to public meetings, but we also know that there's some folks that are new and are not all that familiar with zoning and maybe not familiar with what this project is about. So I just want to talk about the goals that we have that are behind it, that are driving many of the decisions that we're looking at for this code. So first and foremost, as Roseanne mentioned, aligning our zoning code and map with the Rochester 2034 comprehensive plan adopted in 2019. That's not just good practice to align your zoning code and map with your land use plan, but it's also New York State law that, that your code needs to be consistent with a land use plan, which we have in Rochester 2034. So that plan set out sort of the vision for directing where different uses are most appropriate and gets into design standards and things that's of that nature at a sort of a high visionary level. And then the process of updating the code, which is what we're in now, is where you really get into the legal language and the nitty gritty of fulfilling that vision through your zoning code. So some of the other goals that we are working to achieve here are expanding and diversifying our housing choices in the city, including more opportunities for home ownership, looking for ways to increase economic opportunity for our residents and in the region, fostering population growth that is needed to support our local businesses, and through the code, trying to reduce the number of non-conforming uses that we have throughout the district. So if a district says such and such a use is not allowed here, but there actually is that use in that district, then it's a nonconformity. And through the code, we can kind of reduce how many nonconformities there are, because that can create some issues, and we have a lot of them. So those are some of the goals. We have a second slide here of additional goals that we are pursuing. If you go to the next slide. Thanks. So we're looking to find strategies that will encourage the reoccupation of vacant buildings, whether they be commercial buildings or homes. Obviously, the zoning code is not the only tool to do that. The market is very relevant to whether a building gets occupied or not, but we want to make sure that the zoning code is not a barrier to buildings being reoccupied. We also take a close look at our transportation systems, making sure we're looking at the intersection, pun intended, of land use and transportation. So more specifically, that along our transit routes, we are encouraging just a little bit of a higher density of development, whether it just be residential or a mixing of uses, so that folks that live on those corridors have access to transit, and we can encourage more folks to live on those corridors so they have that convenient access, which is to the benefit of our bus system as well. And ideally, a more robust bus system will have more opportunities to expand in the future. So we have to make sure our land use patterns support that. We're also looking at this through the lens of climate change resiliency. And we are resilient in many ways as a city, and Rochester specifically, but we're looking through the zoning code to see other ways that we can improve that. And then lastly, just looking to see if we can make the code more user-friendly. It is a very large document. If you've seen any zoning code before, a lot of legal language in there, and it's an extensive document, and the map is complex. So some of that we sort of have to accept as the nature of zoning, but we're looking for any way possible to make it more user-friendly for both residents, business owners, community activists, that sort of thing, that want to use the code to understand how development is happening, and applicants that bring in a proposal for development, make it user-friendly for them, and certainly for city staff that use the document every day. So we believe that we've made a lot of strides to address all these goals, but I will point out that there are times where some of these goals might sort of conflict with each other, or cause us to take a deeper look at an issue. So for example, promoting home ownership is definitely something that we all value and we're working towards. Sometimes that could come up against a different value of promoting economic opportunity. So we're carefully trying to balance all these things together with all of these complex decisions. And our team has been meeting for a couple of years now, spending literally hundreds of hours together on calls, on Zoom calls, and in conference rooms, going through the code and making these difficult decisions. So throughout the process here, we're looking to the community to react to the draft of what we have put together, and for you to check that against these goals and making sure that we're moving in that direction. So now we can take some time to get into a little bit more into the details of what we're releasing this round, and we are working with a consulting firm called Camiros, who can introduce themselves now and take us through this batch. Arista.
Good. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us here tonight. And just to introduce ourselves a little bit, I am Arista Strunges from Camiros. I am the project manager on this job, as well as principal and partner in the firm. I'm also joined by Chris Jeanette, who is also a principal at Camiros. We are a multidisciplinary planning firm located in Chicago, established in 1976, but we do work nationally quite a bit. We've worked on a number of ordinances. This is a lot of the work that Chris and I do at the firm, and I've been there for over 25 years. Areas we've working in Charlotte, we've worked in Baltimore, Providence, New Orleans, cities really all across the country, including work in our kind of home state of Illinois. In addition, we've had some recent New York State zoning work, so we're familiar with a lot of what goes on in terms of the requirements of the state and how compliance works. Recent projects, you may be familiar with the Buffalo Green Code. We worked on that one. Recently, the Saratoga Springs Unified Development Ordinance was adopted, and we did work in Rome, New York. So just a quick refresher, some of this you may be familiar with from the previous meetings where we looked at a map and we looked at the purpose statements of the districts. But here tonight is we're really going to start talking about kind of the district standards that are in place. So the first group is the residential districts. You see them there, the low density, medium density, and high density. Obviously, see how they increase in density as you go. The mixed use districts, again, related to scale, the boutique, the neighborhood, the flexible mixed use, and the downtown, its own real special district. And then other types of districts. There is the regional commercial, which is more of a traditional commercial district, the village center districts that are in place, and the industrial district, as well as the ones that you haven't seen yet, planned development, but then also two overlay districts, the OC overlay commercial and the OV vehicle overlay. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these. So what you see really is structural changes to the code. And really, as we just saw on the previous slide, it's linking that new district structure were created to reflect Rochester 2034. And so we're really looking at these districts to reflect those policies that Kevin was mentioning and that you've seen in the plan within the zoning structure. We've also tried to make this a little bit easier to use. So design and form standards related to the districts are now found with the districts. So we've moved away from citywide design guidelines and moved more to standards that relate to the scale and form of the district that we're talking about. So you'll see that in some of these districts, in particular in the commercial and the downtown. And there's a new format and organization. We like to call it compartmentalization. I think we made that word up, but I can't verify that. But really what you'll see in the structure is you kind of saw in the first batch that came out, this batch of districts that are coming out today, as well as what you'll see next, it's putting the like regulations together with the other like regulations. So all of parking's in one place, all of landscape is in one place. Makes it a lot easier to kind of really see where all the requirements that relate to some aspect of development are located. And it makes it a much more user-friendly document. As part of that, we've tried to include numerous graphics to help illustrate a lot of what we're seeing, kind of really graphics that help you kind of orient yourself to what the standards are asking of you. So the first set of districts, the residential. So as we're looking at these, again, it's the low, the medium, and the high density. You're seeing the types of dwelling units allowed within those and things like height change because we're really focused on the dwellings. That's really what helps define what's going on here. And I just want to say within this presentation that we're doing tonight, zoning is very technical. There's a lot of different standards at play. So really what we're trying to do in the presentation is orient you to kind of some of the key new things that have been incorporated and how you can kind of look at the chapters overall. So really we won't be covering everything in a lot of detail, just enough to really show you how to use this, to kind of use this presentation to really dig into those standards. So you see the three districts, the low, the medium, and the high. You see in the low density, this is really for single family, detached and attached, and townhouses. So it's 35-foot height. Moving into the medium density, we start to see more different types of dwellings. You see single family and two family, and the two new dwelling types that have been integrated into the code, the 3-family and the 4-family. And then multifamily. And when multifamily gets to more than 4 units, it goes to a special permit process. So it really kind of bridges the gap between low and the next one, which is high density residential. And that really allows for all the different dwelling types. And you can see there as you get into higher density multifamily, you see a 65-foot height. As we take a look at these districts, we've moved away from current minimum lot areas and moved to lot size regulated by frontage. So it's really looking at how you perceive the street. So it's not really concerned with the depth that happens there, but really the lot size is determined by the averages along the frontages of the block. So you're basically averaging what's all around you and kind of fitting into that development pattern that's already there. There are lot coverage limitations. There's two maximums. The first is for buildings, and building lot coverage is really accessory structures like a detached garage and a house, and then impervious surface maximums. And these are really everything that's paved on the lot plus the buildings. And it's really meant to provide some scale and volume control, in particular the building coverage, but also to deal with issues such as stormwater, which is where impervious surface limitations come in. And then again, relating back to kind of following the character that's already in place within Rochester's neighborhoods, the setbacks. When you look at things like the front setback or your front yard, as many call it colloquially, we're looking at it from an averaging perspective. So you're looking at all those lots around you and seeing what that front setback should be in order to blend in with what's already there. And also, this is the first place where you will see design standards. You see here an example of one of the graphics that is within the code as it was released, the draft code that we've got. And you can see that we've got some basic form standards associated with different dwelling types. And the intent there really is to get the good bones of a building in place, but not be so strict that we're kind of talking about one specific type of architecture. And we've provided the illustrations that show some general ways that this can be achieved, but there's maximum flexibility built into those as well. The next big set of districts are the mixed use and commercial districts. And then as you see here, again, like residential, it builds in scale. So we start at the boutique mixed use district. So this is allowing that kind of full range of different types of commercial, but it's a shorter height. It's a 40-foot height. As you continue to move up in scale, you have the neighborhood mixed use, kind of a broader audience for these services and goods. So it's a bit bigger, a 55-foot height. And then finally to the flexible mixed use district. Again, another mixed use district. So we've got residential and commercial going on in there, but really intended to help facilitate some adaptive reuse that's going on. So you can see there a 65-foot height as part of flexible mixed use. And then finally, there is the regional commercial district. And this is the one that attracts kind of the largest audience. It may be a little bit more auto-oriented. So it's really kind of bringing in, as it says in its name, a regional commercial set of patrons. So really, and we saw there an unlimited height for the RC, the regional commercial. But now we understand that, you know, with the way Rochester's been built out, that there's sensitivities. There are residential districts that butt right up to these mixed use and commercial districts. So you can see here in the italicized note, as we're looking at the height, because we know it's a concern, we've been saying that portion of the building that is located within 30 feet of a low density or medium density, that is limited to 40 feet in height to try to create a transition or compatibility between the neighborhoods and these adjacent commercial areas. A couple other things that we use to control the scale of development that's happening as well. It's the maximum building length. This is a new control for a multifamily dwelling. And this would apply to new constructions and additions to existing structures, really meant to not create these kind of large block long buildings that kind of wall off the street and wall off sections of the neighborhood. So it's really meant to control that scale. And you see here, as it increases in length, you start in the BMU at 80 feet and MU up to 120, and FMU when the building is abutting or across the street from a residential or BMU district. So you see that kind of scale increase. Currently, there are maximum square footage controls in the current code. We've brought these in. I believe they've been increased a little bit for BMU and NMU. You can see that each non-residential use is limited to a certain gross floor area. So it's meant to keep these in the boutique, in the neighborhood, small scale. A couple of new things you will also see as you look through the commercial districts. Within all of them, the boutique, the neighborhood, the flexible mixed use, we've put in build to zones, which really talk about you know, how close the building has to be to the street. In addition to that, working with this build to zone aspect, we've also included a build out percentage and a build to percentage. So you see there in that first drawing, the build out, and what you can think of this as is, say, it's the minimum building length. So if we have a build out percentage of 80% on a lot that's 100 feet wide, you would have to have an 80-foot building. So it's really meant to create a street wall. That's why we're bringing in these controls to really enhance that pedestrian environment. The build to zone works together with all of these, and that's the percentage of building that needs to locate within the build to zone. So say I'm just going to use the same simple numbers again. Say my building is 100 feet wide and I have a build to percentage of 80%. use the same numbers because I'm sure that won't confuse all of us, but you have an 80% build to percentage, then that means 80 feet of that 100-foot building need to locate within that required build to zone. And again, this is creating, kind of reinforcing the environment that's been created, creating something that is more pedestrian friendly, really starts to bring in a kind of, a really good commercial aspect, commercial design aspect to the areas. And then there are other setbacks when these are adjacent to other districts. Like we saw in the residential, we've got design standards built in for mixed use and commercial. And again, these are to build in the good bones, to really provide flexibility for both traditional and more modern types of architecture. But at the same time, make sure that we're all kind of meeting a set of basic standards that works. And you can see here another example pulled directly from the code. The downtown mixed use district takes a new approach. So instead of sub-districts, we've created one DMU district, the downtown mixed use district, but then started to look at controls by location. And what we mean by that is you've got controls based on where the frontage of your building is. If you are familiar with, and I believe somebody will throw it into the chat, there are the street typologies created by CAMP. And these street typologies lay out kind of the major network streets that work out through the city. And in downtown, you see a downtown activity street and a downtown link street. These are kind of the highest priority frontages within the downtown. But we know there's other aspects of downtown. So you'll see the controls then go waterfront or park. And then finally, for those that front on an alley or private internal access drive, where the controls are a bit more relaxed because they're really not facing the public so much. You'll see again, when you look at the DMU, that you've got controls on build to zones with build out and build to controls, just like I talked about on the previous slide. There's a maximum building length, but there we've also built in flexibilities that you can exceed this length with either a passage or a recessed design. Those are those two drawings that are here. The mouse is over the passage, now it's over the recessed design. There's standards for that. And in the downtown, it being kind of the core of the city where you really want to see development come, we have an unlimited height. But we did place into this district a control when it's adjacent to an LDR or an MDR district. And you see there, for the first 150 feet, when you're adjacent to one of those two districts, you are limited to a 60-foot maximum height. And again, design standards for downtown. Can't leave that out. So we put in design standards, basic design standards for downtown. There was the current provision in the Cascade Historic District that the two primary building facade materials must be brick and glass. We have maintained that. So you'll see that standard carried over from the current code. The Village Center districts, there are 4 of them. And I'm sure if you live in them or near them, you're very familiar with yours. There's the Public Market, Harbortown, Collegetown, and Marina District. What we did here was reformatted these to match the proposed code, and you'll see we've even carried over the current graphics that are in place there. Substantively, these are the same. There may have been some minor clarifications or corrections, but we did not undertake a rewrite of the Village Center districts. And finally, the industrial district. I believe this is the last of the base districts. There are very flexible standards in here because of the way industrial develops, its needs, everything that's important to that. So really no setbacks would be required unless you are abutting a residential district or, oh, apologies, allergy season. Unless you're adjacent to a residential district or the Harbortown Village District. So then setbacks come into play in those cases. There's minimum requirements. No height limit. And we do have some very limited design standards that would apply when a facade is not located on an industrial link or industrial local street. And again, that's going back to those street typologies from CAMP. So industrial link and industrial local are intended for industrial users. So basically design standards have been relaxed there. But for any facades that face on other streets or are located elsewhere, there's some very minimum standards that need to be met. The open space district also carried over. No substantive changes have been made to this. Again, very flexible to accommodate the different types of open space. And then finally, we have 3 overlay districts. The first is, I'm going to say, is the new overlay commercial district, but it's really not that new as it combines your current overlay office and overlay boutique districts. And what this does is allows for zoning for very small scale commercial uses in residential neighborhoods. So it's kind of a step below the BMU district. You see there's a number of standards associated with this. There's limitations on how big it can be. First, a gross square footage of 1,200 square feet. An occupancy limit of no more than 45 people. We've got hours of operation. Those limitations are built in there, as well as hours related to loading and unloading. So it's really meant to be very small, locally used commercial uses in these neighborhoods. There is the current airport overlay district. This is something that's very specific to airports, specific to flight and safety hazards. And it is something that we are continuing to work with the county on an update of the current standards. So we're awaiting their review. So you won't find any standards. You'll just find a big red note that says we are waiting to work with the county on these. And then finally, there's the vehicle overlay district. This is a new district. And as you can see by its statement, it provides additional areas for vehicle-related uses to locate, where historically they have been successful. And I should probably add to that, that what we mean is these are in areas where these aren't the permitted uses. These are little clusters that may have come up where vehicle repair, vehicle bodywork, vehicle sales have been taking place. And we want to acknowledge that that is part of the fabric and not necessarily make them all non-conforming. So it's really meant to address those areas where it's been successful, but it's not at the scale of a flexible mixed use or a regional commercial. There are standards in there related to, if we go back for a second, fencing, setbacks and screening requirements, and exemptions for those things like the build to zones, which really don't work with these types of uses. And those are the 3 uses currently that we are allowing within this overlay district. We do have a series, the other 2 things that were released in addition to the districts, and I know we've all seen the uses earlier, and a little bit of an update to those came out with this as well, but the last set of standards are general development and accessory structures. So general development standards has a number of components, and we'll just go through them kind of quickly. First is on-site development standards. These are, general controls. This is where you're going to see your current standards, such as designated buildings of historic value, residential dwellings with existing open porches. That's where you're going to find those in this on-site development standards. And that's the first section of this article. The next section is the standards for residential conversions. And we know that this is something that's going on now that we are carrying forward into this updated code. Again, conversion of existing buildings to increase or decrease units in the residential districts. So you'll see here the way that this has been structured in the LDR, the low density. Any residential conversion would require a use variance. If the conversion doesn't meet the standards of this section, and we'll talk about those, an area variance would also be required. In the MDR and the HDR, you can do a residential conversion of up to 4 units if you meet the standards of this section. If the conversion doesn't meet the standards, you're going to need both a use variance and an area variance. So we've got these additional levels of review and control on these, in particular in the LDR. You can see the minimum unit size is required based on the number of bedrooms. This has been unchanged from current code. Minimum building side remains at 1,500 square feet. Minimum lot area has been reduced from current requirements. So we've said 4,000 square feet for 2 units, 6,000 square feet for 3 or more units, changed from 6,000, 9,000 respectively. And then parking, when parking comes out, and we'll all have a chance to look at this again when parking comes out, that you have to comply with the parking requirements for the district. So that's really where we've landed in this draft on residential conversions. Then there's also some very basic exterior lighting standards. These relate to non-residential, mixed use, and multifamily developments. In terms of fences and walls, we've got standards set out for the residential and village center districts. Those standards are in place there. And then in non-residential districts, the standards for those. We do have to say there are allowances for a 6-foot fence now along a street when the fence is 80% open. So think of that like a wrought iron type design, and those are frequently 80% open. Or you could do a shorter 3-foot solid wall, again, to reinforce the street wall that's there. There is an error in the release code. We focus so much on what kind of streets we would allow, what kind of fences we would allow along a street. We forgot about the other ones. Well, we forgot to write down about the other ones. And really an 8-foot fence, as is the current case in non-residential, would be allowed along a yard that is not along a street. So that error will be corrected. Also, we have standards for refuse and recycling containers, standards for mechanical equipment and above ground utility equipment. And then we have permitted encroachments, which you see there in the table. It's an excerpt of the table that's in the proposed code. And these are really things like chimneys and eaves and bay windows and balconies. And when we say a permitted encroachment, it's just how much of that architectural feature can locate within that required setback. And it's really to provide some flexibility in the building envelope so that, you know, you can have things like a nice eave system or a bay window and not have to kind of shrink your building envelope, but provide ways to create architectural interest. And then there's performance standards. These are things like noise and odors. You'll see them, I believe many of them reference back to other sections of the city code, which is common. And then, as I mentioned, we did accessory structures. You'll see there are some general regulations related to how tall they can be, where they can locate, size limitations. You'll see all of that basically talking about where you can put these accessory structures on your yard. In particular, some types of accessory structures need a little bit more care in terms of how they're controlled, or they may need a little bit more flexibility. It can go both ways. And you see there in that list, everything from ham radio equipment to apiaries to detached garages, satellite dish antennas, solar panels, wind turbines. We've created some specific controls for these various types of accessory structures. And then finally, definitions and measurements. You'll see that chapter. The first portion of it is a definition of general terms. There is a note in that article, and just to reiterate, the definitions that are in there now are related to the articles that we've released. We expect that definition section to grow as we release the other sections. So really what we've defined are the terms that we've been using within the chapters that have been released. We've also created a complete set of measurement methodologies for all dimensional and design controls. And you see some examples of those illustrations, in particular yards and setbacks, different types of lots, really to create a section where all measurement occurs uniformly. We all can go to the same section, read the same text, and see exactly how things need to be measured with an illustration to help guide you along there. And so that has been included. That's at the end of the articles. The first part's general definition, second part is measurement.
Okay, thank you, Arista.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, we want to start the discussion, but I need a count from Scott to see if we're going to break up or stay together.
We're going to stay together.
We're going to stay together. Okay, so we are a small enough group that we are going to stay together for questions. So this will be an opportunity to ask questions and clarifications, and I'm going to ask Kevin to facilitate so that we don't all talk over ourselves. We're going to ask you guys, I'm going to find my slide. I'm going to skip the breakout rooms. There we go. So what I'm going to ask you to do for questions then is we're going to use the hand raising. So if you don't know how to do it, here's some instructions on where to find the hand raising on your Zoom. So you've got your raise your hand in reactions. You can lower your hand after you're done. And if you don't want to wait for that or you're shy, you can put your question in the chat, and what we'll do is every now and then we'll ask Doreen to interrupt and give us a question from the chat. With that said too, I am going to say before we start that for those of you who feel like you need to duck out early, I'm going to say it again, probably going to hear me say it many times. Please go to www.rochesterzap.com and share your comments on the code. We would really like to hear how you react to it, what your concerns are, what you like, what you don't like. This is meant to be a discussion and we need to hear from you. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and we'll head to questions.
Great, thanks, Roseanne. Scott, I think you can unspotlight all of us now, and that way we'll be able to see everybody that's here since it's a small enough room.
Except for Alana, maybe she should she stay? I don't know.
Alana, do you typically, when it's a full room or a regular screen, do you typically have a spotlight, or is it okay to just be in the corner?
If you're recording, it will be hard to see the interpreter if she's not spotlit.
Okay, great.
Okay, so
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I do see there's a question in the chat, if we don't see any hands up yet. How do you regulate for compatible use in the various districts? And that's Edwin.
Yes, okay. I thought that was a direct message to me, so that was a little bit scary that it was going, but totally fine. And so if I'm understanding the question correctly, dealing with compatibility of use, we've tried to be very mindful in the use matrix that we created, in which the different types of, we've sorted the uses into each district and tried to make sure that, you know, they respond to the character and the form of the district. I know everybody got a chance to look at it first go round in the meetings, I believe in February, but we do encourage you to visit the rochesterzap.com website, which has all the information on there, and provide any comments on uses that you may have.
Thanks, Arista. Jane, you had a question for us? Go ahead and unmute.
I'm very interested in the capacity to make it easier for tiny homes and for co-housing initiatives to get going in Rochester. I worked for 7 years with a group that finally had to just throw our hands up and say we can't do it in terms of co-housing, partly due to local issues and partly due to state concerns. So I'm wondering if those were taken into account in developing your regulations, and whether you feel that it's going to be any easier or more likely that a successful co-housing community could get going. I will be speaking at 7 o'clock with someone who wants to learn from our experience and get co-housing going here. And I think that a co-housing community would help meet a number of the goals that were stated as the original goals for this whole project.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that question, Jane. Yeah, I would say that we're moving in the direction of making those types of housing easier. Would anyone from our team like to get into the specifics of how we're addressing both co-housing and tiny homes?
I could jump in on the tiny homes. We have no prohibitions on that. In terms of, basically, we've said lot size, and then if the structure can meet building code, it would be allowed. So there's nothing that specifically talks about a minimum dwelling unit size, which is usually where these kind of fall out of favor. In addition, if you look in the uses, you can see a pocket neighborhood permission, which allows for kind of clustering around a common area. You may even have common facilities, smaller homes on smaller lots around this open space area. So it's providing kind of an alternative form of creating almost a neighborhood within a neighborhood. And you'll see standards for that within the use article, the use standards article. I encourage you to look at those. In terms of co-housing, I don't want to step on anybody in the city's toes if they have anything to say, but we can provide experience if desired, but I'm going to let the city take that. So.
Roseanne, did you want to speak up on that?
Okay, I guess I need a little explanation first on what co-housing is.
One of the best co-housing communities in the country is down in Ithaca. It's Echo Village. While they're just a mile outside of Ithaca, they're more like a rural co-housing community. What we were trying to create was an urban co-housing community that can either be a number of independent units collected around what's called a common house that has kitchen, meeting rooms, dining room, where the whole group can get together periodically, but each individual owns their own space, which can be everything from an apartment unit to a standalone home. Or they can be, for example, they're wonderful for putting into an empty large building that can be all in one building, but separate apartment units, and then a portion of the building, and each unit is fully functional, has its own kitchen, etc. But there is also the same feature of some common facilities that folks share, be they external gardens or internal kitchen, dining room, meeting space, etc. So the larger group can meet together.
Roseanne, I could jump in here if you want.
Sure.
So Jane, you were part of some of the input we received early on in this project. And I just want you to know that your comments were definitely part of the conversations we had around this. And the pocket neighborhood is a direct outcome of your feedback to us in the beginning of the process. And so I think you'll like the pocket neighborhood as an answer to what you're looking for. The other co-housing project that you're talking about, we actually talked about that as well. And that really is a multiple family and would be allowed where multifamilies are allowed. So yeah, so both the sort of the options you're talking about are allowed in the code. There's a process to go through, but it's not a use variance process. It's a special permit, or it could be allowed as of right. So I think you'll be happy with the code.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the pocket neighborhood really gives you two options. One is to have, and I'm just looking at the code right now, one is to have individual lots of record, and one is to have everything on one lot of record. So it's meant to allow for slight variations around that sort of pocket neighborhood theme.
I will just add one other note about the tiny houses. For those that are interested in that, if you go to the use table, which lists all the different uses and shows where they're permitted and not permitted, you would not find tiny house in there. We don't consider that to be its own use type or with its own definition. Essentially, a tiny house would be considered a single family home. So you would look to see where those would be permitted, and then it would come down to meeting the dimensional standards of development within those types of districts. Just want to clarify that.
But I also think going to the lots based on frontage and not minimum square footage will also help in the tiny house situation.
Right, definitely. Jason, I believe you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could provide clarity on the intended goal or outcome from banning short-term rentals for low density and medium density zones.
Sure. I could just kind of intro it, but then others on the team can chime in. Well, first I'll say that we're hearing a lot of feedback from the community about this, both in the early stages. We heard it during Rochester 2034 and throughout this process. Got lots of different perspectives from all different angles on this, and we're trying to carefully weigh that. And the way it's sort of currently set up and proposed in the draft is trying to balance opportunities for that kind of use with the other goals that we have around sort of neighborhood character and home ownership opportunities and that sort of thing. So there's just a lot of different things to weigh, but those are some of the things that we considered in that decision. But like I said, we're hearing a lot from folks, and more feedback continues to roll in on that. So there's lots of internal conversations about that. Anyone else from the team want to add to that?
I think I would just add that there isn't a ban on anything in the code. We got rid of prohibited variances throughout the code. What there is it's not permitted as of right. So as it stands right now in LDR and MDR in the draft code, that if you want to do a short-term rental, it would be a use variance. That would be your path.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. I have Bruce going next. Go ahead, Bruce.
Thank you. I had a couple things. I guess we'll take them one at a time for as long as you want to hear from me. First of all, I want to talk about accessory uses for related to the LDR area, for example. At what point the existing code allows for like the renting a room by an owner occupant? Is that supposed to continue or not? And if it is, should that be treated as an accessory use, at least but explicitly in the code rather than buried in like it is in the current code?
Bruce, are you talking about an owner occupant having a roomer in their house?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
That's-
yeah.
Is that supposed to still exist?
What do you mean still? Yes, it still exists. It's still, we're still proposing that an owner occupant can offer up, I think it's up to 2 roomers as
'Cause
a,
I didn't see it in the code, Doreen. And I was wondering if those kinds of things, because they are kind of different, really should be treated as an accessory use.
oh, that's something we could talk about with our consultant, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay, there's that. Now, can I go on to one more?
Sure.
The fact that we've got so many investors coming into neighborhoods and buying up houses with the intent to rent them, which is concerning to the neighborhoods themselves. What in the code is basically going to prevent, should the market collapse or the zoning code all of a sudden change what's allowed and not allowed, for these owners then all of a sudden come in here and say, oh, now we can't make a profit like we used to with our rooming houses. Therefore, we want to convert it into a boarding house without our owner occupant. And we need to do this badly. And we've got a financial hardship, and therefore we should be entitled to do such. What's preventing the ZBA or the CPC from approving those kinds of conversions, shall I say?
So Bruce, for a use variance is what you're describing here. A use variance, the economic hardship test is a piece of it.
Yeah.
But then there also is the piece about impacts to neighborhood character. So there's a 2-step process for the use variance.
I realize that, but I'm just wondering, you're going to get inundated, I'm afraid, with investors trying to convert things over, or existing rooming house people that have invested in basically the existing rooming houses that haven't been enforced for a long time, in trying to then all of a sudden recover their costs or maintain their profits.
So Bruce, I just want to clarify, I'm not aware of all these rooming houses. Are you talking about short-term rentals, or are you?
I'm talking about rooming houses like around the university, where you got 3 or 4 totally unrelated students basically buying rooms up and renting rooms from the owner.
Okay, so I mean, there is okay, so I don't want to get deep into the weeds of existing code, but there is a provision for unrelated people living together, and that would be a code enforcement situation.
Yeah, we need to talk more about, I guess, about the definition of family then.
We might need to. And we should look at the definition of family as it's currently proposed and make sure
Yeah,
we're
that's what
happy with that.
I read that and I was a bit concerned as well. So I guess we'll
Okay.
talk about that further.
Yeah, but please also put your comments on the website.
I will,
so we can look at
absolutely,
it.
and Doreen knows I will.
Okay.
The third thing is, you made a comment earlier, I guess Camiros made a comment earlier on about the frontage, a minimum frontage, like what they call it, was basically a minimum frontage, wall, like a wall for walkable corridors. But what are you doing regarding corridors that never really were intended to walk? Consider the south end of Mount Hope, for example, where you've got these standalone businesses with a sidewalk in front, but it's not really what I would consider a walkable neighborhood like College Town would be. Basically, anything south of the strip mall or the church is really more of a suburban area. Are those kinds of areas being considered and not mandating certain things? Because I think the current thing before the CPC is the fact that we've got a drive through there, which is more suburban based rather than a walkable space based. And I wonder how the code is considering that. The code proposal, I should say.
Okay. Well, I will say, you're talking about the proposed Taco Bell on Mount
Yeah,
Hope,
I am. Yeah.
and that has a neighborhood endorsement. So you might want to talk to the neighborhood group.
Well, I know, but I know there's some question of whether it's going to pass the CPC. And then I'm concerned about there's the tire place and a couple other standalone restaurants.
I think I'm going to let Kevin chime in on this, but I'll just say that I think the intent of the code is in general to move development more towards the College Town model and away from the suburban model.
Yeah, I'm just afraid there's a lot of suburban models in parts of Rochester that maybe probably should in many cases, I think should stay a suburban model. Otherwise, you're going to have really uphill battles for developers trying to turn something into a walkable space with housing up in upper rooms rather than maintaining the suburban model.
Yeah,
I can
I
jump
think,
in ahead of you, Kevin. Sorry, just to clarify too.
sure.
Just want to point out that that's standard. It's the maximum building length along a street.
But I thought there was a minimum building length too.
Oh, sorry. That's what I meant. So it's the minimum build out percentage that we're talking about.
Right.
And it's applicable only in the BMU, NMU, and FMU. So it's not applicable in the regional commercial, which is the RC. So I think this, this conversation that we're having has to sort of overlap both in terms of the regulations and the map so that we can figure out exactly the areas that you're talking about.
But our part of the map, I think, is a NMU use, for example.
So, I think we need to kind of drill down into that level of detail to figure out how we're.
Yeah, I think it would be good to revisit that perhaps.
Maybe that's the comment then, Bruce, is
Yep.
it's a mapping comment versus a code comment.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
I just want to point out though, and this is a little bit of semantics as Bruce, as you're describing it as, a suburban area versus a not suburban area. I think that it's not, most areas of our region are not either one or the other. Well, most areas of the city, I should say. And that there are some parts of the city, some corridors that look a little bit more suburban, but they are still more dense and walkable than, deep into Henrietta or Greece or something like that. So while Mount Hope, the section of Mount Hope that you're talking about, yeah, it does have a couple of drive-throughs and there's one proposed, but even if those, all existed, it is still the city's objective to make every corner of the city walkable, with the exception of, maybe some deep into industrial areas, but all commercial and residential mixed-use areas should be walkable. And we're not necessarily designing the code to just say, okay, this district is just, we have no walkability desires in this area, and let's just go full suburban design. There's no intentions.
Well, I'm
anywhere
not
in the code for
opposed
that.
to having it walkable, but I guess it depends on the definition of walkable in terms of what the expectation is of the type of building, whether you're expecting residential above it or not. Because yes, we do need residential along Mount Hope, for example. But the question is what's the code going to mandate, I guess. So that's all I have for today.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And we're not necessarily mandating, if we're talking about the neighborhood mixed use districts, we're not necessarily mandating that residential be placed above any first floor commercial uses. We certainly would welcome that and encourage that. I think that's good urbanism all around, but we're not to the point where we would mandate that would happen. We've tried that at times, like on Monroe Avenue, and with mixed results. So
I'd love to have a conversation on that after I submit my further thoughts on that. If you're willing to, if you want to talk about what I might come up with.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Sure. I had Josh going next. Thanks for waiting, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, thanks for, by the way, I'm a short-term rental investor. Thanks for being willing to hear proposals from us and hear us out. I thought that was really nice that you guys said that last time and you're repeating it this time, so thank you. I'm hearing a lot about the phone call. I'm hearing a lot about balancing the economy with the phone call just totally threw me off. There's a balance that you're trying to do economically and also with home ownership, right? That's one of your primary goals, as far as I can tell, for banning short-term rentals, is you want to increase home ownership. Is that correct?
Correct. Well,
okay.
I wouldn't say correct to the characterization that we're banning those, but
okay, yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Balancing of those issues, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as we're concerned right now, it seems that scale is tipping entirely in one direction. I can think off the top of my head of 3 different ways to increase homeownership that are far more efficacious than an STR ban. But I can't think of any way to fix the results of an STR ban economically on the city of Rochester. You're talking about $1 billion that were spent pre-COVID by tourists in Rochester. I'm going to try not to be too long-winded, but let me just wrap this up. I feel like you're hearing the whims of your older generation. This isn't an anti-boomer rant, that's fine, but they're not your future. Your future is millennials, Zoomers, Gen X, And we're simply not going to come to Rochester and stay in a hotel. It's not the experience we like. We're far more nomadic. You know, I heard one of the complaints being that you want more of a neighborhood feel, and I understand that, but that's not the future. We're in a pre-COVID world, and we're in a technologically advanced and driven world. And I just don't think it's realistic, and I don't think that's what it's going to look like. The last thing I want to say is that I find this proposed legislation to be incredibly anti-progressive. The people that it's going to impact the most are working class people, minorities, women, youth trying to pay off their student loans, and it benefits nobody more than wealthy hotel owners. And none of us here are that. We're teachers, we own dumpster rental businesses, we're social workers, and we're a broad coalition of races and sexes. So that's all I have to say.
Josh, if I could ask, what would be really useful, if you guys have a group and whatever, is some data. I mean, if you could provide us data of, you know, how many short-term rental owners live in the city and how many don't. Because just looking at the data that's available on the web, it looks like the majority do not live in the city. So whose economy are we helping? So data like that, if you could include that with your comments, would certainly be helpful in continuing to discuss this particular situation.
For sure, but I feel like it's not really addressing the tourist money, regardless of who's owning the short-term rentals.
Well, bring that into it too.
Okay.
Sure. Give us information on the tourists as well as who's benefiting from the tourists.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted issue, and Josh, any data that you can provide around that is welcome alongside of your perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, we're working on that. Who would we actually send that to? What would be the best way to get that to?
www.zap.com.
www.zap.
Sorry, rochesterzap.com. www.rochester. I'll put it in the.
There's a comment, it's already in the chat. There's a comment portal on that website.
And
Okay.
Great, thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Sure, Shah Sayed, did you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of comments. One which just popped up through a label that was put on some of the houses in College Town area as rooming houses. So I think that is a very negative kind of connotation. So let me clarify about that first, and then I'll go to the STR kind of a discussion. So rooming houses conventionally are taken as a negative impact on community, and these are typically considered as low income kind of houses where people are staying. These college town areas where students are staying, these are usually 3-bedroom houses, and the definition or the regulation allows up to 3 unrelated people to stay in one house and considered a family unit. More than 3 are not allowed in current regulation. So there needs to be definitely a discussion about these houses, especially with these kind of labels. And I think these houses are providing a critical service to University of Rochester, which attracts a lot of students from different parts of the country and people who come for like short-term rotations and things like that. And if we have a discussion on that, I would say we should specifically invite University of Rochester to comment on that, because these people are providing a very critical service to these students, because UFR doesn't have enough student housing for their students. So that was the comment on that issue that was raised. Secondly, with the short-term rentals and the home ownership, I think these people who are doing that short-term rental, if that is banned or removed altogether, they will just change their business model to long-term renting. So first of all, it would not help any of the home ownership aspect of the equation that some people think that may improve home ownership or owner-occupant houses. 3, we need to really think about the human aspect of this thing as well. Just like I said, there's a critical need for the students for the University of Rochester that these people provide in that particular college town area. But I do STR in that college town area, and my guests are usually either patients coming from out of city, like Binghamton. I just had a chemotherapy patient who would come and stay with us for chemotherapy, and they are immunocompromised, so they cannot stay in a hotel. Their only option is to drive back 3 hours to Binghamton, or there are people, I had a transplant patient who stayed with me for a whole month before and after he needed to be in an in a protected situation where he cannot be exposed to anybody else in a hotel or even the conventional rentals like rustic houses and things like that. So these are very human side of these stories as well, which people should really think about. Fourth, Rochester is not a vacation destination. So these consulting companies that come to you from Charleston or Chicago or Baltimore, or where people go for vacation. Have you heard of anybody driving from Memphis, Tennessee to Rochester to spend their 1 week of vacation in Rochester? No, nobody comes here for vacation. People come here to visit their families, for weddings, for graduations, or the students come or residents come for their 1 week or 2 week rotation at the UFR kind of a thing. So it's a totally different market that we are talking about. So I think those things should be considered when we make a final decision, and not that ban STR and that will improve economy somehow. It would not, because it would actually decrease your economy, because one, you're losing money that these visitors are spending on local markets. And two, the city and the county will lose the tax that is collected, the hotel tax. So that will be a negative impact of an economy. And these people are not going to sell their houses and leave town. They are not outside investors. Everybody over here, I think in this meeting and in broader STR community, are local investors, or they own 1 or 2 homes, and those are their livelihood. So I think it should be. Now, the other question that was raised was these are outsider people, but my thought is that most of these houses are owned under an LLC, because that's the business model. So maybe that's giving an impact that this is not an individual, but an LLC that has maybe hundreds of houses. And that should also be looked into, as these LLCs are single person owned or these commercial commodities. I don't think this area has that much of the vacation pull where these big multi-housing kind of investors would come into Rochester. So those are some of my comments. But I think University of Rochester should be involved if we are going to label College Town area as a quote unquote rooming housing.
So just to clarify, short-term rental is permitted in the current draft in College Town Village. It's not banned. The only place it's not permitted right now is LDR and MDR. And you would have a path with a use variance to do that, and industrial. It is permitted everywhere else, except for HV. It's a special permit because that's how the current HV code is written. So I just wanted to clarify that, but if somebody wants to address anything else that was said.
And also a point of clarification, and my team can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they're allowed just about anywhere when the owner lives there, correct?
What?
If the owner lives in the house,
then it's not a short-term rental. It's something else.
Yeah, so we don't consider it.
Then we have to look further. Is it a bed and breakfast? There's a bunch of different things it could be.
Right. I just want to clarify that, because I think people sort of casually talking about this will say, where are Airbnbs allowed? Where are they not? You could have an Airbnb that you're renting out part of your house or a room or that sort of thing, but you live there. We don't consider that to be a short-term rental. So those would be permitted in the LDR and the MDR. I just want to clarify that point. But Shai, I do really appreciate all those points that you made. In particular, the last thing you mentioned about the owners sometimes are LLC, which might be just an individual that only has 1 or 2 properties. That is good for us to hear. And as we said earlier to Josh, and you or any folks that are sort of in that industry, if there's any data that you can provide around that kind of draws back the curtain a little bit, so that we can see, how many owners there are, how many properties there are, so that it doesn't appear that there's, one corporation that owns, a couple dozen properties like that, which I don't think is likely, but anything that just sort of help clarifies that picture is helpful. With that, let's see, I think I had John next. John, wait, go ahead, John.
There we go. So I didn't want to overlap too much because I think Mr. Saeed did a very good job of covering mostly what I was going to cover. I see one thing that was brought up is that there's, I guess, an impression now that a lot of STR owners don't live in the city of Rochester. I personally don't, but I spend a lot of time in the city of Rochester. I spend a lot of money in the city of Rochester. I eat here, I drink here, I shop here. And I think that the codes you're proposing, you're saying you're not banning it, and sure, you may not be, but I think a lot of the travelers, at least from my experience, they want their own space. They don't want to be in somebody else's house. And I personally, I know a lot of people that have STRs, they wouldn't be comfortable having other people in their personal home. So you're going to cut out a lot of supply that is needed in the city of Rochester. And furthermore, I mean, the other option would then be hotels. I don't know a lot of hotel owners, but I'd imagine that people with that kind of money don't live in the city of Rochester and don't spend it here either. As a traveler, I think it's important to me that I have access to a kitchen, my own private space. And then, I'm in that community, I'm able to go out and explore and spend money in that community. If I stay in a hotel, there's a bar and a restaurant in the hotel, and that's usually where the money's spent. The last thing I wanted to touch base on, the boarding houses around the student rentals. So I guess, so you guys would not be legislating those out? Those would still be allowed as per your code?
I guess I'll jump in and take that one. So these are not boarding houses. Houses where people are renting to students are not de facto boarding houses. They are houses with long-term leases, and they rent to students who comply with the definition for family. Everything always goes back to the definition for family. And if you're complying with that definition, then you are a family renting a unit.
Okay, that's good. All
That's
right.
just
I got
clear.
a little confused by
Okay.
a previous question. That's all.
Okay, people tend to call things they don't like boarding houses and rooming houses, but those are clearly defined in the code and they are very specific circumstances,
Okay, perfect.
as are bed and breakfast.
I guess the last thing I wanted to bring up, I don't think it was brought up before. So the duplex that I bought, that was going to be a long-term rental upstairs, and the downstairs is a short-term rental. Airbnb brings in, there's a lot more revenue potential. So when it comes to the neighborhood and how the neighborhood looks, I was able to spend a lot more money on renovating this property because of that potential being there. If it wasn't, this property wouldn't look the way it does. So that I think that's another factor to consider, is these Airbnbs aren't just coming in and, destroying neighborhoods. I think the properties are being improved to a higher standard because of the reviews through Airbnb. And there's also there's more money that can be spent on improving the property.
Great, thank you, John. Appreciate that.
Yep.
I just want to pause here and just check the time. We have about 20 minutes left to keep talking with you all. Appreciate all the feedback. I know there's a lot of talk here about short-term rentals, and I just want to assure everybody that we have heard lots and lots of feedback on all different sides of this. I do want to shift a little bit to make sure that there's space here for folks to talk about, one, the actual content of the batch of code that we just released, and two, anything else other than short-term rentals, so that it doesn't take up 100% of the conversation. So I just want to make some space here for folks that have comments on other issues in the code, because it is an enormous, complex document. So anyone that has their hands up want to, Mary, did you want to go next?
You're on mute, Mary.
Taylor was next. Whoever's next.
Taylor was next? Okay, Taylor, why don't you go ahead?
So this is a lot of what I was gonna mention was covered as far as the maintenance of properties when it comes to short-term rentals. But then also I wanted to mention that there are also a lot of travel nurses, because it's close to the hospital, stay at short-term rentals. And I don't know any travel nurses that come into town and stay at hotels. It just doesn't make sense. They need their own space. And then also a lot of short-term rentals are multifamily, maybe a duplex that the other side is rented. So it's housing is provided, and it seems a little discriminatory to for low-income individuals who can't afford to buy a house yet, and to say that only an owner can occupy that property, it doesn't make sense to me. And that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Taylor. Mary, you want to go next?
Yes, in fact, I was at a meeting with a neighborhood that was really upset on how their neighborhood had disintegrated, how there's the lack of community, and with all these new things coming in, new developments and everything, it's going to make it worse. And I don't think I'm sorry, I was late, so I'm sure everybody did, but where's the talk about community? I mean, we were all young once, even the old ones, Josh, I think, Josh. But, and we all went where all the young ones were ate, drink, and were merry, and we had a lot of fun. And however, at a point in your life, especially when you have a family, you need community, and you need the safety of a community. And what I'm hearing down here is a breakdown of community. It's a moneymaker for those that want to invest, but the ones that suffer most are those that are in poverty in our city. And I think we have to be very conscious of the importance of taking care of our people in poverty and making sure they have good communities, good schools, and God help us, we make sure they get good jobs. So I would say we have to put some emphasis on community. When people want community in Rochester, just like the gentleman that eats and drinks here and has properties here, they usually buy in the suburbs. That says it all. So let's also think very strong on how, especially those in poverty, who don't have a chance to go and buy in a suburb because they don't have the means, how they can have a good quality of life. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mary. And again, we've heard a lot about short-term rentals issues. I want to make sure that there's space for people to bring up other issues, in particular about the code that was released now. So does anybody have additional comments or questions off of that topic? Jan? You're on mute, Jan.
I'm another short-term rental advocate, so I apologize from that standpoint. However, on the other hand, I think that it's yelling at you loud and clear that you've released an enormous code with a lot of information in it. And the people who are most interested in the code are people, small individual, usually small investors in the area. Also, I'd like to point out that your result in this immediate ban of any areas for short-term rental will result in people looking at the suburbs only for purchasing of homes with the idea that they might rent them. It will simply be easier. And that's, sadly, I have to tell you that short-term rental, the people who are coming in are not usually low-income people, and not usually, you're right, they are usually travelers. They are also your neighbors returning to visit the neighborhood, the area. I am a short-term rental host myself, but not in Rochester. I've considered investing in Rochester, but what this environment tells me is no, stick with suburbs and further out for basically, I know that I am a homeowner who feels strongly about my vacation rental home, my home, as being shared by me as the user and guests as the user. A short-term rental doesn't necessarily never be used by the host. In fact, hosts frequently host families in the neighborhood themselves, some of their own families returning to the area. This is a very cottage industry. We are not Florida. You are not going to have a lot of people wanting to invest. Otherwise they would be here. you would have lobbyists. You would not be having little individuals here speaking to you. We're a little group people. We're a small organization. We're a little group that's passing info going, hey, you might be outlawed. Hey, don't go there, kind of thing. And you're basically, I know the city has suffered with loss of people in it, and you have an outside ring that is basically an enormous part of the larger metropolitan area of Rochester, and it just forces people to move just out of the city with their search for this. Instead, I do agree that short-term rentals are, because they are relatively new, cottage industry, they are relatively unregulated, which may be a problem. And I do understand that there may be an onus for some regulation, but full outlaw is not really a good next step. A good next step, and a good indication from the amount of interest and pushback here, might be to table this section to create something in a group community organization that creates joint regulations. And the short-term rental agency or organizations are not at all, the few that there are, a few of us talking and gathering, are not opposed to regulation. In fact, they want to be at the table. The good owners cannot be good owners without good reviews, which means happy guests, happy neighbors. I know when I make a point, and most of the people who are bothering to be here are short-term rental guests or owners, I literally will go to the neighbors, knock on the door, give them my business card, and tell them that I'm their partner and friend, and that I want good people in this house, and I want their neighbors and their family to come rent this house, please. And please talk to me about this, because if you see anything going on, I want to know. You're my best help. And the neighbors can be your best help at a short-term rental. Your friends helping you watch that house, which you may live in or half live in or part-time live in. So also your definition of this, I live in the house in Airbnb it, I don't live in the house in Airbnb it, is a mistake. We're massively changing society. Like Josh says, I'm on the other end. I'm approaching retirement in the next few years, in my 60s. So basically, I'm a short-term rental host. I'm a short-term rental person as well. And I just would like to say that I think that just pure complete outlaw or a ban for any area is a mistake without tabling it for more consideration, considering everything that's happening. And I know that this is part of that. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Jan, just to clarify, it is not banned everywhere in the city.
No, you just have certain little regions. I understand at this point, kind of thing. And I do know that there needs to be some compromise that also includes more regulation for short term. We want bad players out too. Actually, so do the lead, the huge listing sites, Airbnbs and VRBOs. They want bad people out too, because it's bad for their name. It's bad for all. And so it's the sharing economy idea. And I do understand it's not banned in all areas. And I do understand that this is still in proposal phase. And so I'm saying to you now, before you outlaw, outban, or completely make it against code so that variances are required, it's going to have to come back probably to be revisited. Either that, or it'll just drive out people from investing in that area whatsoever, which is fine. A lot of people will just shrug and go, okay, the other areas. But it's kind of sad, because I think it's not viewed exactly appropriately.
Well, again, I would again ask that it would be great to have data, because the data that we do have is pretty much that these are happening in the areas where we don't have empty houses and we don't have hardship in getting people interested in housing, that they're competing with people who are buying these houses for rental, taking it away from home ownership. So any data that you can give us to show that this is not correct, to show us that this is benefiting areas where we have empty houses, or we have people who could use the extra income, and it's not just in the areas where everybody, where we already have competition for houses just for people who want to live there, that would be great. We do not have that data right now. We could use that data if it exists.
We will try to organize quickly enough to do it, but you're talking about a bunch of individuals that are loosely attached, trying to gather information on their part-time.
Well, a lot of it is,
do
you know, you can get it through Airbnb and whatever. And the other thing I will say is there's nothing in short-term rentals that says that you have to be part of one of these communities that does this policing.
True.
Again, that goes to your point of maybe there does need to be some sort of subcommittee looking at these, particularly for regulations, but there's nothing, and that's not a zoning thing, right? Because those organizations change over time, and zoning is land use. So there's got to be some way of dealing that. Just like you can't zone it for the people who take care of their property and the people who don't, or the people who don't rent it to people who are just going to party there Saturday night and have a huge party. How do you do that? So you raised some good points that maybe there needs to be some sort of subcommittee look at this.
Yeah, thanks for chiming in. We appreciate your perspective on this. Again, we're getting close to 7. Either in the chat or anyone else here have any questions that are not related or comments that are not related to short-term rentals. Did I miss anything in the chat, Doreen? You're on mute.
No, it's mostly about the STRs.
Okay. Anyone here in the room have any additional comments or questions unrelated to that topic? Jason, I know you're a short-term rental owner. Mary, did you want to talk about something different? And if there's time, Jason, we can come back to you, but I just want to make sure we make space here. Mary, did you want to talk about something different?
You're on mute.
Who's going to be, where's the liability on these short term? You know, we do have the sexual offender lists.
Okay, so not something different then.
Right. Yeah, well, it is something. Yeah, it is liability, which we all know who's in the neighborhood. But will the owners of these short term bed and breakfast be liable for anyone they bring in if they don't notify the neighborhood if they are on a sexual offender list? And who, you know, will they be held liable if something happens? And one just has to kind of study what's going on in New York City with bed and breakfast. I've been there, and there a lot, and it can get out of hand. Can I ask one question? Does the person who is running it have to live there at the bed and breakfast?
Yes, for bed and breakfasts, yes.
Yeah, it's not. All right, thank you.
Okay. Seeing no other hands, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Roseanne, you might have started to answer the question I was going to ask in regards to the areas. I own a duplex in the Park Ave area. You know, my kids live there, 3 of them. We're surrounded by long-term rentals filled with college kids throwing parties nonstop, right? I have to go a couple blocks over to get to the quiet part of Park Ave, right? I think it's tough when we have a short-term rental property that is the quiet house, and we're surrounded by long-term rentals, which won't be impacted by any of this, who are just, you know, out of control. Again, I feel like the message has been said, and I don't mean to belabor the point. It's just the data doesn't seem to back it up. And Roseanne, to your point, we'll absolutely try to get you that data. It just seems like maybe generalizations are being made, and I can give firsthand accounts of long-term rentals that are a nuisance as well. So.
Okay. And yes, I would welcome, again, www.rochesterzapp.com. I would welcome your comments. I would welcome data. This is a draft code. So we are taking comments. Things are still under consideration. Okay.
During one last check, anything from the chat?
No.
Okay. Let's do one more and then we can wrap things up. Go ahead, John.
The last thing I wanted to mention, the city has nuisance points, and my understanding of how that's been applied was to properties where there's drug activity and the RPD busts it. I don't know exactly what the legislation is around that. and Maybe that's something worth looking into. That's maybe a better way to moderate problematic short-term rentals rather than going out and saying the owner has to live in it, otherwise you can't do it.
We got so many problems.
Thanks, John. Okay,
Thank you.
we're at 7 o'clock here, but of course, this is not the end of the conversation. Please go to the website at a minimum to sign up you can enter your email address to get updates of when upcoming meetings are. And as has been mentioned, there's a spot in there for submitting further comments about the draft code. Definitely encourage you all to review the draft documents that are on there. And so, as was mentioned earlier in the presentation, we're looking at sometime this fall, releasing the third and final sort of remaining sections of the draft code to kind of fill out the complete draft. And we'll do another round of public meetings at that point. And, as was the case tonight, the conversation will not be limited to what's released in that third batch of code sections, but certainly anything that has been released and is part of the code will be part of the conversation. So we hope that in the fall that circumstances are a little bit better, not just COVID, but staffing wise, for us to do a mix of in-person and virtual meetings. We think it's important to be able to do both. We'll do our best to do that, but please sign up on the website to stay tuned for those updates. And lastly, just want to once again thank everybody. It's a beautiful night out. We appreciate that you took time out of your spare time to participate in this. That is not lost on us. We really do appreciate that you care. These things matter to you, and I just want to promise to you that they matter greatly to us. And we're weighing all of these issues very heavily because they're difficult decisions, and we really appreciate folks in the community chiming in on their personal perspectives. So unless anyone else from my team has anything they want to add, we can say thanks and end our virtual meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, Roseanne, and missing their name. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.